ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start today's presentation. This is the fifth in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series that has really taken hold within our community, and we've had great pickup on once we've posted this to YouTube. Lots of feedback from communicators across the country thanking us for really having not just the courage, but taking the opportunity to really have this discussion within our community, but also in the public relations community. And we know that there is a great deal of work still to do. We started this off with Gail Strawn's presentation on institutional racism, and then Char's presentation on representation in the Black Lives Matter era. And then we had Chuck Wallington from the US talk about representation for male Black public relations people, and then Sarah 2 weeks ago doing her case study on institutionalization of racism and how organizations can begin to deal with that as well. So today we have the great privilege of having Parm Chohan come back and recount his research that he did on diversity and inclusion a number of years ago while he was in the MCM program, but then taking that and really talking about it in this era that we are, this moment that we are having discussions about how do we ensure that we are more inclusive, that we are more equitable, and we are more diverse in our organizations, but also in our communications as well. Parm works at the town of Caledon, but has had a great career in communications, and has always brought a great sense of humor and personal training and fitness to his research. So Parm, I want to throw it over to you, and I look forward to moderating the question and answer period at the end of it as well. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Terry. I appreciate the kind words. Folks, I apologize in advance for my camera not being on. I'm having some laptop issues, which is unfortunate because I got suited and booted in my fancy tuxedo and everything today just for you all, but I'll take a picture and send it out instead. Nonetheless, today's topic is diversity, inclusion, and communications. And this topic is based on a premise that, we know or should know that D&I, at least from a human rights perspective or social justice perspective, is the right thing to do. That's without question. We also know that organizations in corporate Canada should be more diverse and inclusive, but realistically, that's not always the case. So my thinking was, why not tackle the topic of D&I from a slightly business perspective, where if implemented and nurtured properly, not only can D&I create a healthy work environment, but it could also lead to competitive advantage and business success. And I'm sure that's something that all of corporate Canada can understand and salivate at. So if they don't get it from just a social justice perspective, why not just hit them with, hey, it can help your business. So get on the train, right? Also, the workforce is looking very different these days, much different than it ever did. And that's due to well-trained and intelligent new immigrants, visible minorities, First Nations community, the LGBTQ community, those with special needs, and a whole variety of other groups and individuals. So let's also keep in mind that while it's okay to recognize and appreciate the differences between us, let's also progress in the conversation and ask, how can we use those differences to better connect with and serve our audiences and communities? Okay, so we're going to initially touch on a couple of definitions that I had come up with, that I had created and developed, but from a slightly more business POV. We're going to talk about why D&I matters, and then roll into the importance of practitioner diversity, and then quickly talk about strategic and then tactical D&I, and then we'll wrap it up with a fun short video. So for today's talk, let's maybe set a baseline of what diversity and inclusion means. And these are a couple of definitions that I had developed while I was doing my capstone research, where the essence of diversity is all about bringing forward diversity of thought, right? And then the essence of inclusion is how that diversity and diversity of thought is accepted and respected in the workforce, and then also harnessed and captured and done something with so that it can contribute to business goals. So simply put, diversity is the what and inclusion is the how, right? So think of D&I as a fantastic, great, powerful tag team. You know, there's a lot of great tag teams out there, the Heart Foundation, Legion of Doom, Rock and Roll Express, British Bulldogs, all Hall of Fame worthy because I'm a pro wrestling fan. So D&I is that tag team where together they can pack a great punch. And then when you start layering on communications and you start throwing communications into the mix, well, now you've got a recipe and ingredients for a very powerful platform, a very powerful way to push that D&I forward. Okay. Now, let's maybe talk quickly about recognizing difference. So it's okay to recognize and appreciate the differences that exist between us, whether it be skin color, age, your background, education, sexual orientation, or what have you. It's okay to recognize those differences. It's not okay to treat someone poorly or give preferential treatment because of those differences, right? So there's a fine line, but well, actually, it's not a fine line. It's a giant, thick line between being okay to recognize differences and then treating someone differently because of those differences, right? So, for example, it's okay to say, and if my camera was on, it'd be okay to say, "Hey, Parm, you look good in your black turban today." And I'd be like, "Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I appreciate that." What's not okay is maybe, "Hey, Mr. Coworker, you're old and you shouldn't be managing our social media accounts because it's mostly young people on Instagram these days," right? Now, that's obviously a very basic and rudimentary example. But again, the point is that preferential or different treatment, right? So it's okay to recognize and appreciate those differences because that's when we can start turning those differences into something that's positive, beneficial to others, or can simply lead to that competitive advantage. Right now, in the municipal world, at the town of Caledon, maybe that looks something like, you know, using the knowledge, skills, ability, and experience of staff, whether it's professional experience or life experience, using all of that to help create certain policies or procedures. Right? Maybe it means being open to recognizing and appreciating differences to help create and lead to strong personal engagement with residents, the community at large, businesses, community groups, and other stakeholders, right? And each sector, each organization has that ability to use those differences in a positive way. But ultimately, being able to execute on that is key, right? So we can talk about strategy all we want. You can put as much dollars behind and get as much input from diverse staff groups all you want, but putting it into action is what sets you, an organization, apart, right? Talk is cheap these days, and we're seeing that where, you know, it's very easy to act like you're on that D&I train and put up a nice image on your website, but ultimately there aren't any changes behind the scenes. So that's something that we want to be aware of. So why does D&I matter? Why is it important? Who cares, right? Well, I'll tell you why, because immigration has grown in Canada. Now, according to my research that I did in 2016 for my capstone, at that point in time, there had been over 200,000 new immigrants to Canada every year for those previous 10 years, right? Now that's a huge number. And most were immigrating from places like Asia, Africa, Middle East, Europe, the UK, and also more females were immigrating than males, right? So as you can imagine, with increased immigration, that means more people of diverse backgrounds are reading your corporate messages or your campaign messages, engaging with your staff, consuming your content, buying all the products and services that corporations and retailers have to offer. So that means that the messaging itself has to be inclusive where it can be for the majority of those people to understand, right? Increased immigration also means a new and diverse workforce. So all of this then places much more importance on D&I and communication strategy, relationship building, messaging, HR recruiting practices, all of that. So from the top to the bottom of the organization, D&I impacts all of those functions. And that leads us to practitioner diversity. So for communications to be able to support a growing function of D&I, or even if comms is catering to diverse audiences, which we do all the time, it itself needs to be diverse. I mean, that just makes common sense, right? So practitioner diversity is absolutely key. Now, for some organizations, there typically isn't a D&I department to help with this overall function, right? But we still need to be mindful of our internal and external audiences that we communicate with. So for example, right, maybe let's take a simple example of running a social media campaign. Knowing that certain jokes or pop culture references are probably not going to be understood by all. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use that lighter language or use those pop culture references or jokes, but just understanding that there are going to be some audience members who won't understand that reference, right? Now, scaling it and kind of going down to a micro level here at the town of Caledon, we've been collectively as a comms group have been able to implement some of those things. So for example, we had a traffic calming strategy that was to be executed about a year and a half ago. And that's something that I directly worked on. And when it came to social, the way I had developed was the first round of messaging was fairly simple, direct, very corporate, so that it could be understood by all. And the second round of messaging was a little bit looser, a bit more fun. And then the third round of messaging, again, back to that corporate look, right? So these are some of the assets that I want to show you. But for example, this is the asset that we used on social that was supplemented with a very corporate, quote unquote, grown up message, right? Our second round of messaging was a little bit lighter. Okay, I'm a big Fast and the Furious fan. I'm a big rock fan, so I figured, hey, why can't I have some fun with this? So the second round of messaging was a little bit lighter, a bit more fun, and interestingly enough, we received a lot more engagement on this Fast and the Furious graphic and message, right? So again, while it's a very simple example, the point is that when we're running things like a social campaign, being diverse and inclusive in the message, in the assets that you use is okay, but still understanding and knowing that these references are not going to be understood by all, right? So maybe 70% of your messaging is corporate, straight to the point, and then 30 or 20% is a little bit lighter, fun, something to that effect, right? And that's what we try to incorporate on our end. Another example with all of that is, again, at the town of Caledon, another example comes to mind where we had new transit coming into Caledon, and that was an extension of an existing Brampton transit line. We had a number of marketing and promotional materials that we needed to translate into Punjabi because the community that transit line was going into was heavy South Asian based. So I was able to help and assist with that. So again, having that practitioner diversity just sometimes helps the flow of those tactics and those executional items come to fruition a little bit easier, a bit smoother, because you've got some of that intel behind the scenes, right? Now, from a strategy point of view, D&I has become much more important to organizational success and can impact significantly corporate reputation, product and service delivery, your internal culture, community development, competitive advantage. We also know the workforce, like I had mentioned, is looking much different these days. So 3 important areas that are impacted by D&I are corporate reputation, communication strategy, and corporate social responsibility. And those were 3 areas that I had explored in my research a couple of years ago, where I was able to look at about 15 different company websites, conducted in-depth interviews with 12 senior executives to ask some very, very interesting and pointed questions. Now, while some of you might be super excited to sit through a dramatic and animated reading of a 70-page capstone report, I don't think we have the time for that today, but to sum it all up, while it's important and acceptable to recognize color and diversity, it's even more important how that color and diversity is treated, right? And from a business perspective, that color and diversity can become a superpower for that organization, for your organization, if it's harnessed appropriately and properly, right? While diversity and inclusion is extremely important from a human rights and social justice perspective, again, like we mentioned, corporate Canada, for the most part, could be missing the mark if they really don't understand the gift that D&I could be, right? Now, keep in mind that there are a lot of organizations that aren't being as diverse and inclusive as they should be. And sometimes through smart communications, they're able to cover that up. So us as a communications community, we also have to do our best to ensure that we're talking appropriately, honestly, authentically with our stakeholders. And I think it's okay to hold business groups and colleagues responsible so that we can make sure that we're delivering those authentic messages. So if something isn't quite true, then it's perfectly okay to push back as needed, obviously in an appropriate manner. Because ultimately we have the duty to be the conscience of our organizations, right? Now, going back to these definitions quickly, the foundation of competitive advantage can really be seen in these 2 definitions, right? Where, again, when we're talking about diversity, the secret sauce is really that diversity of thought. When we're talking about inclusion, the secret sauce is how people are treated, and if they're treated properly, their uniqueness can help achieve and propel some of your business goals. So from a strategic perspective, diversity of thought is a good thing. And if that diversity of thought can be harnessed, it can help reach that organizational vision that everyone is trying to strive to. All right. So what are some examples of tactical D&I or D&I at the tactical level? So again, according to the research that I conducted, interestingly enough, most of corporate Canada is not leveraging D&I, is not implementing D&I to the best of their abilities. Okay, there are some that are doing it quite well. So one example came up where of a multinational potato chip manufacturer that wanted to target a specific flavored chip to one particular ethnic group. So to do this successfully, they were conducting product testing on an employee resource group of that ethnicity, and feedback on taste, packaging, and a few other criteria was provided. A number of changes were made, and this resulted in an extremely successful product launch. Actually, one of the most successful new product launches for this organization. So as it stands now, the parent company of this potato chip manufacturer regularly tests new products on its employee resource group, right? Because they are a small sample of their population. So that comes right back to having that diversity of thought, harnessing that so people feel accepted in the workplace and can bring their whole selves to work, and then really being able to tap into that diverse superpower to help that organization move forward. One of the CEOs that I was able to interview shared this interesting quote. It's about recognizing the access to great talent who is representative of the customers to be served. Okay, so looking at this from another perspective, another CEO that I had interviewed offered some interesting insights and shared that investing in community initiatives can be more robust and diverse if decision makers are themselves diverse, right? And I quote, "If Canadian-born men and women are making community engagement decisions, perhaps there might be investment in local kids hockey or breast cancer, both great causes. But if there are people of different ethnicities involved in these decisions, community involvement could also include various ethnic groups, charities, fundraisers, and more." So really the key is to have a diversified community engagement plan if we're talking about community engagement, right? Another example was provided that there's a Canadian-based oil and gas energy company where they have a First Nations board member. Now, because of this, more attention is given to First Nations concerns. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that if you don't have diverse decision makers, there won't be any diversity in projects or causes. That's not the point here. The point is that with diverse decision makers, it just helps increase the chances when you have different people around the table for those projects, causes, campaigns to also be diverse, right? I was able to do some additional research and came across an article by an author named Camille Dundas, and she talks about why governments must look beyond social media for diverse hiring. Now, Camille mentions a number of interesting things and how important it is to sponsor community grassroots groups and really work at that grassroots level. She talks about how important it is to set aside budget for ethnic advertising and marketing, which many organizations do, but then also being able to consult with them on the best way to reach their community, right? And there are some ways that you can do that. She also goes on to say that attending a variety of events and being involved in a variety of groups is absolutely crucial, because that's where you could find your next VP, CEO, or candidate for other job postings, or find your ideal cause or an appropriate cause to be able to support. Camille also talks about creating mentorship programs within an organization to help open the doors to potential employees who might never have considered a career in that field or that organization. All right. And she goes on to say, and I quote, "It requires an intentional brand strategy that has diversity at the forefront and is backed up with an authenticity that cannot be created from behind a keyboard." Right? So I refer to that as intentional, authentic action. And let's also not be keyboard warriors. Right? It's easy to make decisions and push out information right behind a keyboard, but the hard work is actually getting into communities, building those relationships, and nurturing those for that to grow. So to recap quickly, some of the tactics that are pretty quick and relatively easy for most organizations to be able to execute on are things like creating an employee resource group and leaning on them for feedback and guidance, diversify decision makers for community engagement opportunities, sponsoring and working with grassroots or community groups, setting aside budget for ethnic advertising and marketing, attending events or being involved in projects or campaigns and groups that are diverse across, that are culturally, ethnically, socially, politically diverse, and then also creating mentorship programs at your various places of work. So what can we do as individuals, right? We can be aware. So let's be aware that what you might consider normal communication, tone, examples, references, or jokes, they may not be for other people. It doesn't mean you have to stop, but just be aware. Be aware that having a diverse and inclusive workforce will help create diverse and inclusive relationships, messaging, internally and externally, right? So practitioner diversity, so crucial. And also remember that we all have unconscious bias. All of us, we've all got unconscious bias, and that's okay. But let's learn to turn that into conscious acceptance and inclusion. So again, to highlight that it's okay to acknowledge differences, but let's just be aware of how we are expressing that acknowledgement, right? So let's keep in mind that, yes, it's okay to highlight that we're all different and accept that we're all different, but let's also progress in the conversation and ask, how can we use those differences to better communicate with and serve our audiences and communities, right? We all have unconscious bias. We all do. That's okay. But let's work on turning that into conscious acceptance and inclusion. And with that, folks, thank you very much. And if we have any questions, comments, concerns, we can maybe open up the floor.
Yeah, Parm, that a great presentation. The video, Parm and I were talking about it and how it really breaks through the clutter. The challenge is I don't remember, and Parm didn't remember who the company was or who was the sponsor of that. So that's where sometimes we have to make sure that these messages, they cut through the clutter, but what's the organization or what's the end result at that point? So Parm, so let's follow that video. That guy comes to you and, you know, runs back to his office, and Parm said, or he says, "Hey, Parm, I need your help. I just met this like Korean woman, and she was really rude to me, you know, telling me that my fish and chips are good. I'm not even English. I'm American." So how do you get to him?
I'd probably have to backtrack on the conversation and ask, how did the conversation start? And that's where I'd probably be able to pinpoint, boom, right there, Mr. Dude. Those are probably some of the questions that led her to respond the way she did. And it's likely not that she's being rude, but she's really reciprocating on the same premise that you had asked those questions, right? So, and then also try to explain that, yes, while it's okay to acknowledge differences, you still want to be mindful of how you're expressing yourself when it comes to that, and what questions you're asking, right? And it's difficult to say that, okay, this question is off limits and that question is not, because every context is different, every person is different. But for the most part, I think it's common sense that we have to invoke when we're talking about certain things like this, because usually common sense and logic will indicate what's appropriate and what's not.
Anita Erskines, who is a candidate for the MCM program from Accra, Ghana, asks, excellent presentation. How important is D&I training within the entire company, and where should it start from?
Great question. I think it's very, very important. At the town of Caledon, we're actually starting to develop our D&I strategy, and we're hoping that it will be implemented next year. That's something that I'll be supporting from a comms perspective. So I think these days we're seeing a lot of stuff happening in the world. So more than ever, that D&I training education is needed. And I think the first place to start is to have some conversations with management, with your senior leadership, and identify why there is the need, and then kind of work for them and beyond that. And obviously it's usually to develop some kind of a strategy, have some kind of a consultant come in. Those are typically the steps, unless you have in-house expertise. But it all starts with having some of those uncomfortable conversations, like we mentioned some of the previous Tuesday talks, having those uncomfortable conversations, asking why are we doing things like this, or why was this done, or why not, in an appropriate way, of course, and then progressing and following up on that conversation. It's not just a, hey, I'm going to talk about it once this month or this week because I know it is something at work, and then that's it, right? So for example, if your sales are down, that's just, and you're primarily a heavy sales-based organization company, your sales are down for Q2. You don't just talk about it at the beginning of Q3 and then that's it, go on your merry way. That then becomes the topic of focus for Q3, right? Because there's a problem in the system. So likewise, if something isn't right from a D&I perspective and something wrong is happening, or there is an education gap, it's not just the topic of the month or topic of the year. It's engaging and having those conversations on a regular basis. Yes, it might be uncomfortable, but again, as communications professionals, we're also part of the conscience of our organizations. So it's our responsibility to be able to have those conversations, to be able to nurture and facilitate those conversations.
I like how you've situated this DE&I initiatives within the strategic imperative of an organization, right? That it doesn't just make sense, or it ensures that the organization is in compliance with civil rights, human rights, social justice issues, but you make the case, and you did in your capstone, that this is in fact an opportunity to create a strategic point of differentiation within your sector, your competitive sector, whether that's municipal government, whether that's for oil companies or whatever it is, that this can in fact attract great talent. It can align you with the needs of your stakeholder groups and speak to them directly from the outreach that you're dealing. And so I really like how that is. And, people ask the questions about, how do we do it? How do we make sure that everybody's trained up, or that we're worked in within these fields? But the step back, how do you get that group, and I'm going to use a North American paradigm. When you're looking at senior leadership teams and you look at a sea of old white guys, how do you get them what's the end point on strategy to get them to realize that, we need to be more reflective. Grunick talked about it. Larissa Grunick called this, requisite variety, right? How do we actually have those connections and programs in place that we are representative of the communities that we serve?
Great question. I think one of the first things is to talk about the trends of immigration, because that's raw, hard data, right? So new immigrants are coming into Canada every year, more and more, and they're highly intelligent, skilled individuals, right? And not just the working force, let's say the non-working force, but they're also coming with a lot more wealth than they've ever had before. Not everybody, but there's a trend. And people will speak with their money, right? They will speak with their purchasing power. So if you're a products and services type of a company, and you're missing the mark with a particular demo, you're going to see that in your sales numbers. And before you can do anything about it, it'll be too late. Right? So and again, this is just not excluding that diversity, equity, inclusion is very important from a human rights and social justice perspective, but sometimes some organizations don't get that. So you got to hit them with a little bit more, and you hit them with those hard numbers and the hard data to say, hey, this is what these immigration trends are showing you. If we're not going to do something about it, guess what? We probably won't be as profitable as your next competitor, right? And I think that's probably a launching pad to start having some additional conversations once they start realizing that, oh shoot, there is an opportunity, and not just the opportunity, there's a potential for loss because we're not hitting this new demo that's coming in right now. You can argue if that's an appropriate way to deal with it, but what is the conversation if there is an organization or a board or a senior management team that just doesn't care from a culture perspective? That's probably far and few between. But what if then you hit them with the hard facts and you hit them with the numbers, you hit them with those immigration trends, and try to spark some kind of conversation after that.
Or you hit them with what's happening around society today with, the challenging nature of the social unrest that we see, and, the knee-jerk reactions, or I would say the tokenism in messaging to try to align organizations with communities that call out bullshit, right? That they are easy to see through this lack of authenticity. So, would you advise an organization, if it hasn't played in this sphere, if it's not progressive in DEI fields, how do they respond, right? So that they don't want to be called at saying, well, you're not responsive, you're tone deaf here, but there is an alignment between actions or history of the organization and potentially vacuous words.
Internal change has to start in the inside. Putting up a picture on your homepage of a person of color, or putting up a billboard of a person of color, while everything internally is the same and not diverse and inclusive, means nothing. It's fake. It's false. People will see right through that. Right? So I think it starts with that internal change, and that doesn't have to, you don't have to be announcing that at the rooftops. It's not a competition. Start with that internal change, make some changes, whether it's to training, the type of staff that you're hiring, the type of staff that you could bring on. As that starts to happen organically and naturally, that information will come out. Your employees are your ambassadors, right? And that information and that vibe and feeling, that culture will start to be seen externally once that internal change happens, right? And it's also the same with ourselves. I mean, we can dress ourselves up as nice as we want, but if on the inside we're not right, and we're filled with anxiety and stress and all of that, then what good does a fake exterior do when the interior and the internal isn't healthy? So I think it starts with some internal steps, and you don't care about what that may or may not look like externally. Obviously, you don't want to be doing something absolutely inappropriate externally. That's not the point. But the point is, focus on the internal, and then that public perception will start to change organically, which will carry forward a lot more weight than throwing up a photo on your homepage of someone of color and trying to act like you're diverse and inclusive.
Yeah, putting lipstick on a pig doesn't change the fact that it's still a pig, right?
It's still a pig. Yeah.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions of our superhero Parm here, who's done such a great job in continuing to live the research that he's done in the MCM program? I'm not seeing anyone. So, Parm, how do people get a hold of you if they want more insights and information on how to better develop DE&I programs within the communications sector?
Yeah, you can see me. You can get to me on LinkedIn. My town email address is parm.chohan@caledon.ca. My personal email is parmsc@yahoo.com. Yes, I still use Yahoo, but LinkedIn, Town of Caledon, or Yahoo is all good.
It's okay. My wife still uses AOL.
Nice, nice. I like it.
Old school. Old
That's
school
it.
dial up
That's
too.
it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We have Eileen Marlowe will be on next week's Tuesday Talk. Eileen will be talking about developing engagement strategies for First Nations communities, Indigenous peoples. Eileen is the counselor, the special advisor to the Premier of the Northwest Territories, and also an MCM grad. And we look forward to her perspectives as well. So stay tuned for more Tuesday Talks in the MCM program. Have a good week, everybody.